Welcome back for a special edition of the Up North Journal podcast. I'm host Mike Adams.
Dan DeFaw here.
We are just north of Detroit. We're in Danny's backyard, actually. Danny, tell them where we're at.
Actually, we are. We're just north of Detroit. I grew up just south of here, but today's a special day, I would think.
Yeah, we're at the Weber Wildlife Museum, and we want to thank them for having us in. But today, we're going to actually talk with a congressional candidate for the 10th District here in Michigan for the U.S. Congress, and that is none other than retired Brigadier General Doug Odie Slocum.
Yes, it's great to be here today, and once again, a special shout out to the Weber Museum and to Dick Birmingham for inviting us in here. What a great place and what a great backdrop to have our discussions today.
I couldn't think of a better place. I mean, this is simply incredible for all of our viewers and listeners out there. For those on the podcast that can't see, you've got to check out the video because this place is simply incredible of what we're being able to see today. But we want to talk to you today because you're right here in our back door. You're running for the 10th congressional seat for the U.S. Congress here in Michigan. And we want to know a little bit about your retired Brigadier General.
Yep.
You were just down the road here at Selfridge Air Force Base a few years back when we were working down at the store across the street.
Okay. Well, it's fantastic, and you're right. I was the commander out at Selfridge Air National Guard Base, or as we like to call it, Michigan's hometown air base here at Selfridge. And it really is the last major military installation in the state of Michigan, the 9th largest state population-wise. And it's amazing the things that go on out at Selfridge. There's 45 tenant organizations as well as the 127th Wing that serves as the host out there. But the men and women and what they do is absolutely fantastic, and it was the greatest honor of my life to be able to work out there.
You know, hats off to everybody who's served our country and who is currently serving. I remember when Danny and I, we'd go down there for the morning, we'd get ready to go in the store, and there was times that we actually got to watch some of the A-10s take off. Simply incredible. One of my favorite military jets to actually watch. Simply incredible.
Yeah, the A-10 is a fantastic airplane. Biggest, baddest gun ever designed, and they figured out how to build an airplane around it. But it does an amazing mission for our military, and once again, I'll have to go back to the men and women that make it all happen because it is a PhD level type of a mission that they do that does fantastic work supporting our troops and our allies.
Well, you spent some time down there. Give us a little bit of background about yourself, your military background, and why you're running for Congress.
Sure, that's a lot to unpack. 35 years in the military, actually, and 34 of the 35 years I was blessed to fly airplanes, and I was a fighter pilot, so I've gotten to fly F-4s, F-16s, and then A-10s while here at Selfridge for the preponderance of my career. So flew active duty for 7.5 years, then I've been full-time with the Air National Guard since then. A lot of my time I was down in Tucson at the International F-16 Training Center. So we would teach other countries as well as U.S. pilots how to fly, how to work together, as coalitions. Mm-hmm. So I've worked with over 40 countries around the world. And then in 2009, I actually applied for and was selected for a job back in Washington, D.C., still with the Air National Guard, running safety. So a lot of the programs that we did for flight weapons and occupational safety, suicide prevention, and some of those types of programs. And then 1 year as the Inspector General back in Washington, D.C., and then I applied for and was selected to come out here and be the commander of Michigan's hometown air base. The National Guard is a real different animal because it is the constitutionally established militias of the states. And they work for the state, you work for the governor, so it's unique how it's very different than active duty.
Yeah, thinking back about some of the things you're just talking about, you've been in the military, you've been active military, you've got that experience, you've been in Washington, you've seen how Washington works, and working for the state militia here as well, working with the governor. So you've got a pretty well-rounded background as far as being able to work with all factions of the politics that make things go.
Well, working with just the allied countries and the diverse cultures and the different way that different countries work, and learning how to cooperate and work together to communicate and have relationships with people as well as organizations. Back at the national level, how do you work with different government agencies and the like to be able to get things done mm-hmm. for the international training? But then the time I got to spend in Washington, D.C., working these different programs at the national level, seeing some of the chaos and quite literally at times dysfunction that goes on there, and understanding how to work through that. And then the time as the Inspector General, of course, is just invaluable in terms of there's so much you learn about why people do what they do, and with great training, than to be able to come in here to Selfridge. Now, one of the things, my leadership style I've always branded as violent positivity. So it was coming in, and people respond very well to positivity. So when you take something, you give them the benefit of the doubt, don't make it a one mistake organization, and you figure out what you have in common, what you can get done, it's amazing. Because Selfridge was under a lot of stress when I showed up here. So not only that leadership style to our organization, but then we wanted to reach out to the community. And so we started working with a lot of the community leaders, our influencers around here, building those relationships that ultimately led to like the F-35 effort to try and get the F-35s based here. We had the 100th anniversary of Selfridge. It's one of the oldest continually operating installations in the United States. And we had a 100th anniversary that culminated with an air show, 235,000 people on the base and another 100,000 on over 10,000 boats on the lake. But it was a great opportunity to tell the huge story of Selfridge, the heritage that's out there, and to tell the story of the men and women. About 70% of the folks out there are what we call drill status or MDay. They're part-time, if you will. They do full-time things in the community, but they still serve their state and their nation. The stories just are endless, and it's fantastic. We like to call hometown heroes out there at Selfridge that do great things for this community, and it was my honor to serve them.
That's incredible.
It was awesome growing up in this area myself, knowing Selfridge over there. Now knowing somebody that ran the place just kind of makes it all, because as a youngster, I played my softball tournaments on the base, and that was the only time I could go on the base, and it was a kind of cool thing, and it's like, ooh. But now meeting you and hearing about it, it's awesome, and so thankful for you guys and the men and women that you overseen and turn this place into, like you said, 100 years it's been here.
Yeah.
So love it.
The history, if you ever get a chance, there's a wonderful air museum out there that you can go see some of the history of Selfridge, the planes that have been there, the history, the people that have been there is just amazing in its own right. But to this day, the men and women out there are doing our state and our nation's bidding, selflessly serving, what they sacrifice, the time away from their family, and then balancing work, school, life, other things, and in addition to that service, the stories are just amazing and endless out there. A fantastic group of people. If you know any of the guardsmen or the folks that work out at Selfridge, grab them, listen to the stories, because it's great.
I've had the opportunity to talk to a few people in the military that I've worked with, and you're right. What they sacrifice for us is simply incredible. Just take the time to stop and shake the hand of a serviceman or woman and listen to their story. It's mind blowing. A lot of these are just simply mind blowing what they've given up for us. But I'd like for you to dive a little bit into why. Okay, you're now in the military. You're now retired, and you decided to take on this endeavor of running for Congress. Why did you do that?
The second part of your question that we hadn't got to yet was, so I retired in May of 2019 and decided I was going to go off in a second career and started working that with a great company here in town. And when the incumbent, the congressman now, announced that he wasn't going to run, all of a sudden my phone started ringing. And quite honestly, it wasn't one of these, ooh, yes, this is what I've always wanted to do. It took a lot of considering, a lot of looking at what the situation is, what's the right thing for us going forward, us being my family primarily, talking with them and what our goals and our objectives are. And it took a couple months to actually decide that, you know what, I see this as a call to continued service. I've been able to serve the men and women, and we did some fantastic things with this community, and this is just the opportunity to grow and continue to do those things for the Michigan 10th District and for the state of Michigan.
Well, along those lines, I tell you what, we're going to step outside, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to dive a little bit into something you had mentioned earlier about that you're not only serving the 10th District, you're serving the state, but the people across the nation as well, because if elected, the policies that you're going to be affecting is not going to affect just the 10th District, it's going to affect everybody across the United States. And I want to dive a little bit into, you're a huge Second Amendment proponent, and we want to dive a little bit into the wildlife side too, because federal policy obviously dictates some of the things that happen here in the state of Michigan, and that's what our listeners and viewers would like to hear from. So
I look forward to the next segment. This is going to be a good discussion.
We're going to step outside and we'll be right back after this.
One thing about being a fighter pilot, you always have to be prepared. On 9/11, we weren't. I was leading a training program when the first tower was hit. We were called into action to defend our home from whatever might be coming next. We cut the locks off a facility that hadn't been used in years, scrambling to arm our jets. Without weapons or being fully equipped, If something happened, we were ready to do whatever it took to defend freedom. Growing up, my dad instilled in me the importance of leadership, service, country. Serving in the Air Force allowed me to achieve my dreams of flying jets and serving my country. For years following those attacks, I patrolled our nation's skies to protect our homeland and to keep America safe. I later assumed command at Selfridge, Michigan's hometown air base, where I served our state and our nation. Now, our nation's values are under attack again. This time, we see it coming.
Welcome back. Another segment of the special edition of the Up North Journal podcast. We're here at the Weber Wildlife Museum, and once again, we want to thank them for letting us be part of this.
I tell you, just briefly walking around here when we got in here to set up, you want to talk about walking around the world.
Right.
I mean, you start off here, it looks like in Texas, and you end up in Africa over there.
It's simply incredible the amount of animals that they've got here. And we'll talk a bit about that here a little bit later, but we want to get back to retired Brigadier General Slocum here that's running for the U.S., the 10th congressional seat here in Michigan for U.S. Congress. We mentioned going into the break, you're a huge proponent of the Second Amendment, and the policies that you could be affecting is going to affect everybody across the United States.
Correct.
Talk a little bit about, number one, your Second Amendment standing and where your policy or your thought process is on that, but also the responsibility of not taking on just the 10th seat, but also how it's going to affect the whole United States.
Okay, well, let's start with the Second Amendment,
Okay.
because there's a lot, when you talk to most of the candidates, oh yes, we're pro-Second Amendment. But let me explain a couple things on why I stand the way that I do. One is, I own firearms. I've started to try and learn a little bit about reloading.
Okay.
I love shooting, sport shooting, and I own a number of guns, both pistols and long rifles. One of the guns I purchased not too long ago was a Scar Heavy.
Okay.
And I like that gun. Tan color, 20 round magazines, Vortex scope on it. Love this gun, fantastic. Unfortunately, I've only shot it once so far that I've owned it, and people ask why. But the important part is that, one is I don't own that gun to go hunting, and I don't own that gun to protect my home. I think it's important that I can own that gun, and I think it's very important that I do own that gun. And the reason why is because if my government's concerned that I own that gun, I have a problem with my government. Because when you look at the Second Amendment, what the Second Amendment is about is what draws the distinction between us as citizens and subjects. And we have to realize that any time in history when the government owns the means of coercion over the population that they are serving, or they're ruling over in particular cases, it doesn't ever turn out well. So our founding fathers got it right. The Constitution doesn't give us the right, it basically guarantees that the right given to us will be protected. So for me, we need to make sure that we are able to own firearms, do what we do, simply because it distinguishes us and our liberties going forward. And I really worry, if the government worried about me having a gun, I'm worried about my government, and I will fight against anything that goes against that principle.
Absolutely, and it's good to hear that, because I tell you what, it's kind of nerve-wracking hearing everything that happens, and you get little bits and pieces of what people they say, but then you start reading deeper or listening deeper, and you start realizing, it's kind of not what they're meaning, is what they say.
Well, let's dive into this a little bit deeper here. The Second Amendment, right to own firearms. Is there, in your mind, a point at which there should be some limitation on what style of firearm?
Well, we have limitations on styles of firearms. You can't go out and get an M250 caliber heavy machine gun, automatic. There's restrictions that we have on firearms and everything that are in place right now that in a lot of cases people kind of forget that we have those restrictions in place, and they say it's unrestricted, and that's not really the case. We want to be able to exercise those constitutional rights that we have, but at the same time not infringe upon those. So I'm a little skeptical whenever we go down certain paths in Washington, D.C., and you say, well, it's just a little bit, the red flag laws, it's just,
right.
Well, the trouble is incrementalism, taking a little bit of those away at a time. So for the most part, I'm immediately skeptical whenever we start talking about banning, limiting, or whatever, rights and liberties, especially at the federal government level. We need to be very cautious about that, because we could head down a path that I don't think is good for the United States and for what we stand for.
Not at all.
Yeah, a current law that's just been signed President Trump actually, stroke of a pen, banned bump stocks. Is that something you support?
I'll answer that the way that I just did,
Okay.
which is any restrictions on firearms I'm skeptical of.
Okay.
Because after bump stocks, what's next?
Okay.
From there, what's next from there? I guess I have mixed emotions on that because of what happened with the bump stocks and everything in Las Vegas in that particular shooting. But at the same time, I don't think restricting the firearms is the answer. It's the behavior of individuals that we have to look at. It's the responsibility of the gun owners and the responsibilities of the citizenship that we need to be focusing on, as opposed to trying to limit it through the firearms themselves. We've got our focus on the wrong place.
Okay, along those lines, red flag laws, that's one step that people are saying now that they want to use to go down that path of looking at people versus looking at the firearms.
Yeah.
In your mind, where do we go from where we're at in the current status of where things are right now? What would you suggest as a legislator, if elected, that you would try to implement in that same arena, but maybe not the red flag law, but I mean, what's on your mind along those lines?
Well, once again, skepticism comes to mind when I look at the red flag laws, because who's determining who the threat is? Who's making that determination to then take that individual's rights away or deny them the right to own firearms? That's where I get very skeptical, because it's going to differ between different authorities that are looking at it or implementing those laws. And I think it's ripe for abuse. If you have somebody who's trying to restrict Second Amendment, they're going to use that in a way that's nefarious, that's against the intent of our founding fathers in all of this. So my initial is that most of those red flag laws and everything else should be looked at skeptically. I haven't read a lot of the details that are in some of those, but for the most part, we want to make sure that we're protecting first, and then only under certain circumstances and extreme circumstances if there's ever a reason to. So that would be my take on the red flag laws. I think, once again, it's an incremental way to try and curb firearms and our Second Amendment rights.
Along those lines, do you think that's more of a state's responsibility versus the federal responsibility to look at people and vet them as far as being able to own a firearm or not?
Absolutely. You know, from a big picture perspective, when we look at our Constitution and the way everything is set up there, it's all about limiting the power of federal government. And wow, have we gotten out of focus with that. So more things that we can push to the states, the better. Very rarely is our federal government the answer to any problem. There's times and places, and I'm sure we're going to get into some of those, where the federal government has to be able to tie those rights of the states and things that connect the states that we need to help regulate, that we need to focus. But once again, I think we turn to the federal government way more than we should, and we should be looking to the states, the local communities, to solve the local problems. That's the way to do it efficiently, the way to do it smart, is we need to delegate that out and quit putting everything on the federal government.
Okay, looking along the lines of firearm ownership, you know, we hear things about, like we mentioned, the bump stocks, magazine capacity, micro stamping, putting taxes on ammunition, making firearm owners take out insurance, things of that nature that are limiting. And those are more on the state levels that we're starting to see. I want to back up just a little bit, though, on something with the military. Selfridge here being a state air base, I mean...
Well, it's a federal installation.
Federal installation.
Managed by a state agency. It's a very unique animal that we have out at Selfridge here in Michigan, that the National Guard, the Department of Military and Veterans Affairs here in Michigan, manages that federal installation. So there's a lot of interesting equities that we have out there on that base.
With the state being the ones that are managing that, and looking along those lines, even though it is still a Fed type agency, or a federal air base, who has that jurisdiction over there, and do you support firearms on air bases or military installations for our servicemen and people?
Well, to begin with, from a philosophical, I think that we should be able to exercise our Second Amendment rights anywhere. So yes, I'm a very big proponent of that. And one of the things that you'll find that's very unique, it might be the only one in the country, I'm not sure, but when you go on to Selfridge, you'll notice there's a big yellow sign that stands up there, and it says, firearms are permitted on this facility. And I believe the word is something like in accordance with Michigan law, or something on the bottom down there. So our Michigan hometown heroes have the right to exercise their Second Amendment rights out at our hometown air base. And that was a tough fight. That was a couple years of who's, you know, all the lawyers have to get involved, what's federal, what's state, whose statutes, whose authorities, and all to be able to do that. But I'm very proud of the fact that installation has that sign out there and that people can exercise that right here in Michigan.
Well, if elected on the federal level, is that something you'd like to see changed across the nation?
Absolutely. Once again, leadership by example. We were able to do that, and I would be a big proponent of that. You know, from that level, people ought to be able to. We see the consequences when they're not. We saw what happened not too many months ago down in Pensacola when folks aren't armed, and it's the same when there's one side armed and one side not. It's like sanctuaries, you know, where people aren't allowed to carry firearms or something like that. It becomes prime for incidents.
Yes, it does.
Okay, let's on the federal level, there's been a lot of talk lately, at least from the conservative side, about reciprocity of concealed carry across the United States. You know, most states generally accept other states' concealed carry license. There's some that don't, and depending on where you're traveling, there's different rules and regulations as far as what you have to do with your firearm, whether you have to break it down, stow it, you know, put it in a lock case, what have you. What about reciprocity across the United States? Is that something you'd like to see changed, or what is your stance on that?
Absolutely. I mean, if I'm driving across country and I want to exercise my Second Amendment rights, I almost have to be a lawyer nowadays to be able to go
Yeah.
this state to this state to this state. And what are the different laws, rules, and everything else. Consistency and standardization would be great in a pro-Second Amendment kind of a way. Because some states have a lot of restrictions and everything else. So yes, having that consistency across the state lines to me is just common sense way to do things. We're putting way too much of a burden, and you know, in a lot of cases that's the intent, is make it so administratively difficult that it's a deterrent for people exercising that right. And I think we ought to be doing just the opposite of that right now, which is let's facilitate it, let's encourage it, let's encourage responsible gun ownership. That's what we want to do with everyone.
Okay, last question here on the Second Amendment, and we'll take a quick break. But let's say that you win the election and you go to Congress. On the Second Amendment side, what's one of the first things you want to see worked on, that you're going to take a part in and work on for the American people here in the United States?
Well, once again, I think the Second Amendment's in place, and what we need to do is protect that. So the main thing would be is make sure that there's not bills and legislation that are being introduced that are going to infringe upon that.
Okay.
So from a pro-Second Amendment standpoint, outside of like reciprocity agreements and things that we were just discussing, it really is to make sure that the intent of the Second Amendment stays in place, that we're not incrementally infringing upon that as we go. So it's more of a protective role, a very active protective role for that Second Amendment right at the federal level.
All right, I tell you what, we're going to go ahead and we'll step outside, we'll take our next break, we come back, we'll dive into a couple more things here. Once again, we want to thank the Weber Wildlife Museum for allowing us to be able to conduct the interview here today. We'll be right back after this.
Washington is being overrun by politicians driven by their own self-interests that do not represent the values that I fought to protect. Professional politicians so consumed by endless investigations and impeachment that they are failing the people they were elected to serve. We need real leaders in Washington who will stand up for the values that this country was built on. I'm General Doug Odie Slocum, and I'm running for Congress because our nation's under attack, and I'll do what it takes to defend it. I'll fight to secure the border and continue to protect our homeland. As a Christian and a father, I'll protect the things that truly matter and defend the right to life at all stages. And I'll work with President Trump to continue to grow our economy, to fight radical policies, and to lead on issues important to our country, to Michigan. We don't need more of the same in Washington. We need a total commitment to defend freedom, no matter what it takes. At Selfridge, we came together to make a difference. Now, it's time for a new mission. If you're ready, I'm ready. Fights on.
Welcome back, everybody. Back for our special ed edition, sitting down with Mike and Odie himself. Why did I call him Odie? Stay tuned. We'll get to that later. But anyways, we just talked about the Second Amendment a lot. And well, all fine and dandy, but there's some things going around in the state here, specifically CWD, TB. We've got Asian carp on the shores. So I think what we need to do, Mike, is how about we dive into that and ask what he can do to help us in the state of Michigan.
You know, with CWD being such a huge thing right now in the state of Michigan, and actually across the Midwest, it's I won't say it's exploding, but some people say it is. Some people
Okay.
say the state's on fire. With that being said, from where you stand, is wildlife disease control research, is that more of a state issue, or is that more of a federal issue, or maybe working together? What are your thoughts on that?
The answer would be yes to that, because I think there's a role for both.
Okay.
Once again, you heard me say that I think we need to delegate to the states. What are the hunting rules? What are the things that are specific to the states? That, for the state of Michigan, they need to be deciding that. From the overall research and development, coming up with technical solutions and things that we can do to help the situation, I think the federal government does have a role. Because when you see, the deer, strangely enough, they don't honor state lines.
Yeah, they don't. They don't know where those
They have a tendency
boundaries
to
are.
go across and everything else. So there's an issue here that goes across the state boundaries. And then there's also the ability to bring the resources of the multiple states together to advocate for things that are good for the states. So I definitely see that there's a role for the federal government in helping come up with the solution, but implementing that solution is where I think we need to make sure that we're coordinating with the state and local level, because once again, that federal cookie cutter approach to things doesn't work right. What works in Michigan is going to be different than Wisconsin, is going to be different than Ohio
or Montana or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Everything's different.
Well, along those lines, is the role of the federal government, in your eyes, is that just to bring people together, or is it funding? Is it both?
It can be both.
Okay.
One is it's a coordinating function to be able to bring all the different equities, because the other is there might be somebody overseas, international, that solved this. And the state of Michigan will have a lot more trouble being able to access that and bring those resources together. So money is not the answer to everything. We have to understand that there's a lot of, when we're able to bring a coalition together, advocate. I always say from a leadership role, you have your prescribed boundaries of things that a book says you're going to do, but real leadership goes beyond that. It's the informal, being able to influence people and bring people together. Once again, that's my international background, working at the national level, seeing those types of things come together to solve problems. And I think the federal government, there's probably a money role to be had in that, but money doesn't solve all issues. So let's get all the smart people together to come up with the answer, because maybe it costs this much to solve it, maybe money's not the answer. But we haven't gotten there yet because we haven't come up with the technical solution to deal with a lot of these things.
Along those lines with the money issue, is that more, do you feel that's more of the sportsmen, the outdoorsmen and women responsibility? I mean, we've got the Pittman-Robertson Fund, we've got the Johnson-Dingle money on the fishing side, even with Asian carp. Should the money come from those funds, or is that, if money is going to come from the federal government, should it be allocated from the federal government out of a separate fund, or should the sportsmen be the ones responsible for this?
Well, the sportsmen, I assume you're talking about private funding versus federal or governmental appropriated funds type of spending. And once again, I think there's a role for both. When you want to know where somebody's heart is, follow their checkbook. Mm-hmm. So if this organization wants to help solve that problem, they should contribute to it. It's not necessarily because they're going to financially solve it, but it's an equity. It's buying into the solution. It's being part of how are we going to solve this problem. I think from the big, deep pocketbook standpoint, everybody always turns to the federal government. There's a time and a place that the federal government can help us do things. A lot of times we look and the federal government collects money and then gives it back in grants. I always shake my head when we do that, kind of going, well, maybe they shouldn't have collected those taxes to begin with, and that's the state and local level to do things. So maybe we shouldn't tax people so much if we're in the role of collecting and redelegating, because that's just an inefficient way to do business.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the deep pockets or organizations that want to contribute. We've had somebody that we know here in the state of Michigan that actually made a comment on a thread this week about that the federal government needs to stay out of some of these things, and we need more people like wildlife outdoor organizations, whether it be Whitetail Unlimited or Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. Some of these bigger groups take a vested interest, or on the Asian carp side, maybe a Trout Unlimited, of allocating money out of their coffers to help solve some of these problems.
Well, one of the things I always tell people, as my role in the past of being a CEO, if you will, a commanding general, is that I have to understand that I don't know what I don't know, which means I'm not the expert to solve things. And the legislator's not going to be either. I mean, these are people with a wide variety of backgrounds, but I'm sure very few of them are outdoorsmen to the level of being able to scientifically address these. So I always say that, you know, God gave me 2 ears and 1 mouth, and it's to use it in that ratio. So it's to listen. The experts on this stuff are going to be the ones in the field. It's the sportsmen that are going to care about this. They're the ones that are going to be able to help us come up with the solutions. So Washington, D.C. needs to listen a lot more than they end up talking to us. That the solutions are going to come from the local level, and we need to empower those folks, encourage that, get that level of engagement. That's how we're going to solve these problems, not turn to Washington, D.C. and say, you do it.
Did you hear that, folks? I love this. You know, my mom always told me the same thing. She said, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Listen twice as much as you talk. So I like that. You know, recently they said $30 million is coming from the federal government down to the local levels for CWD research on a wide scale. I mean, I know you said you don't know a lot about CWD, but with that amount of money, to me that's a lot of money. Maybe on a wide scale it's not a lot of money, but
well, my thought would, as we were to dig into that and get a little more granular into it, is if they're giving the state $30 million to research it, are we being redundant? Did they give another state $30 million that's doing the exact same research somewhere else that we're being inefficient? You know, if we combine that, I'm guessing we could come up with a solution for everyone. So once again, I'm a little bit skeptical when the federal government wants to come in to solve a problem. But we need to focus and be efficient with the taxpayers' money. And man, I tell you, I think we take our eye off the ball on stewardship a lot of times, which is every tax dollar should be cherished. It should be realized that we're taking away from private citizens that are out there doing good work for our economy. And it better be for a good reason, and we better make sure that we account for it, and we're doing things as efficient as we possibly can.
Well, that's kind of where I was going to go along with the lines was, you know, $30 million for all the states to me is not a lot of money. I think there's 21 states now that have CWD, and you divide that up. That's not a lot of money. I feel, to me, it's a lot of money personally, but on a wide scale level. And that's what I was going to ask is with doesn't matter the amount of money. Do you think there needs to be accountability in showing and transparency of these agencies, state agencies or states governments themselves, of showing where that money is being spent on this research and et cetera?
Well, just like any business, you always have to make sure that you're tracing the money trail and there's accountability. Can't just give money and let it go. That's the root of corruption right there. All right, so there has to be where we're accounting for money, we're auditing, we're making sure that it's being spent for the purposes that it was designed for to begin with. But I'll go back to, you know, you're saying the 30 million is that, you know, there's wonderful educational institutions. There are people that are the smart brain trusts in a lot of ways, that $30 million can empower a lot of resources to be able to get together with a brain trust to be able to address something. So we could be looking at, you know, maybe there is the right solution if we do this the right way. But back to the accounting side of things is absolutely every single dollar needs to make sure that there needs to be visibility. If 2 years from now somebody said, what happened to that money that we put towards CWD, that we can go, here's what it was used for and here's what was resulted from that. Because people need to know what the money's being spent on.
You make better choices down the road.
Well, just like we looked at, we were looking up for the price of the testing for CWD, we noticed it was a wide range from $17 to $90 depending on what state. You know, I'd sure like to know why one costs $90 and one costs $10, and kind of how come it just doesn't cost one price? It's so
where's that money? Yeah,
being accountable and having that transparency to the people out there as to what's going on. We're getting all this money. This is what we're doing with it, and this is how much we're spending on it.
Well, and transparency in government and what we're doing, you know, once again, I think we've taken our eye off the ball a lot, because we've got to remember, the government works for us. They answer to the people, not the other way around. The government shouldn't be going out, you know, there's rare times of national security and everything else, but the government owes us answers. It's simply the way that the system is set up. And once again, I think we're getting that backwards way too much a lot of times. The government is telling, they're banning, they're prescribing, they're doing things that is outside of the scope of what I think our founding fathers wanted in the Constitution. So we need to get back to those constitutional principles, which is going to give that accountability, and we have the relationship right between the voters and those that they vote into office to be their representatives.
Let's chase a rabbit for a second. Along those lines, if elected, and you're in the U.S. Congress, how would you hold yourself accountable to the constituents of this the 10th district. I mean, how do you see turning that around? Because right now you say the government's kind of taken over, and the people are serving the government versus the government serving the people.
Mm-hmm.
What would you do when you're there to turn that around for yourself?
Well, and that's excellent because, representatives, you go back and you do the work in Washington, D.C., I think that there's a tendency to really focus on there. My focus is going to continue to be on the district itself. The most valuable thing I think I'll be able to do as a representative is to go into the district and talk and, like, back to what we were saying, listen to what's going on. What are the questions? What are the answers? If you're concerned about this, ask me and I'll tell you. One of the most effective things we can do in a leadership role is communicate well, which means we need to be able to have that two-way dialogue. It's not just me talking and telling people what's going on. It's listening, what are the concerns, answering those, town hall types forums, things like we're doing right now. If somebody could submit questions, be able to address those. So to me, it's always going to be about having that two-way dialogue because one, I want to build trust. People need to understand we're always going to have differences of opinion, but we need to have a level of trust that people can understand what is my motive, what's driving me, and I need to listen because my job is to represent the people of Michigan and the people of the 10th district. And the only way I can do that is to understand what it is they need, what their wants are, what their concerns are, not the other way around.
And I think you hit a really good point when you said about listening and speaking, but then you said also, you're not the expert. So it sounds like that, given the problem, you looked to experts to solve the problem for the people.
Yeah, and to get inputs, you bet, all the time. There's very few things that I would consider myself an expert on. So it's getting the smart people around you, and I've been blessed my whole career. It's like working out at Selfridge. I had some of the best folks that worked around me that I could trust, that I could let them go do their jobs, which allowed me to not be tactical in the day-to-day, but to be able to be strategic and do a lot of the things that we did. It's simply by having smart, good people surrounding you. And that's what we need to do is leverage all this great resources that we have here in Michigan and in the 10th district. My job is to listen to them to figure out where we need to go. My job is just to facilitate that.
Listening to the people. Right now, what we're hearing a lot of in this area, and it's something that you're quite familiar with, is PFAS. PFAS in the water. We've got a problem up at Wurtsmith Air Force Base that's got into the groundwater up there. They're telling us up, in Lake Van Etten, don't eat the fish. The surrounding swamp area around Wurtsmith, don't eat the deer because of PFAS. With the firefighting equipment and that chemical, what is your background with it?
Well,
First off.
and thanks. I didn't know what PFOA was until about, 3.5 years ago,
Right.
When all of a sudden it came up as a big issue. What I've learned in this short period of time, certainly through a lot of the efforts, is the military started testing early on for PFOS, PFOA in a lot of the installations, and you'll notice that most of the national attention is on military installations around the country. Michigan, with the water issues we've had in the past, very sensitive to that. We started looking at military installations. But the reality is PFOS, PFOA is that family of chemicals is used in a lot of things. And that only a small percentage is used in firefighting foam, but every foam that was designed to fight petroleum-based fires has a PFOS, PFOA component to it. And it has been used in a variety of places, manufacturing, different, it's in a lot of places, and I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface to see what it is that PFOS and PFOA. We've taken some common sense approaches to better chemicals in the firefighting realm. Once again, that's a small portion of what's going to be a bigger problem. How to clean it up? Right now, my understanding, the only technical solutions are still filtering type solutions. When you're talking watersheds, is an impractical way to do it.
Right.
You can't filter a watershed.
Right.
No, not really.
In a practical way. It's very expensive, very difficult to do that. We've had some cases of spills and everything else that inordinately expensive. I think what we're going to see across the country, one of the problems is there's not a standard necessarily for PFOS, PFOA across the board. So what works in New Mexico versus down in Georgia versus here in Michigan, I don't believe we still have a consistency of definition of what the issue is, what are the standards, what is okay, what's not okay, what are the exposure limits to it. There's still a lot of inconsistencies, I think, across the board with that. At least the last time I was kind of plugged into what was going on in that. I think we're going to hear a lot more about it before we hear less when it comes to PFAS and PFOA.
Well, if you're elected and you're in Congress, what kind of things would you like to see be done in that arena? I mean, like you said, you can't filter a whole watershed, but what direction would you have legislation start in to take care of some of these issues?
Well, a couple great things with it. First of all is you heard me say there's no standards yet.
Right.
So what is the real health issue from this? And if they have defined it, what are the limits? What is it that we should be setting as boundaries and numbers, and how do you test and everything else? And I don't believe we have that standardized, because PFAS hurts people in Wisconsin, Ohio, other states just as much as it does us here in Michigan. So we need to have a consistency with that to begin with. And the other is water flows across state lines. Our wonderful Great Lakes touch so many different states.
Countries. Canada.
Countries, and everywhere you go, this is going to be an issue. So this is one where I will say, I think our federal government certainly has a role that needs to be played, because this affects everybody and it goes from one to the other. So this is where we need to have that coordinating, please, I'm not advocating that all funding needs to come from the federal government, but that coordinating function so that we're being efficient, that we're being smart with how we're dealing with it, and not trying to deal with it 50 different independent ways. Brings those resources together to be smart and stewards for the taxpayer. Solve the problem, do it efficiently.
All right, well, I'll tell you what, let's take another break. We come back, I want to kind of dive into the fishing side of things. We've talked a little bit about the hunting with CWD, PFAS, and those types of things, but we want to dive a little bit into maybe the Asian carp and get some thoughts on that as well. So
it's not a metaphor, you mean literally diving in with Asian carp.
Diving in with Asian carp.
All right.
Or they're going to jump out of the water and dive at us, I don't know. One way or the other.
Aluminum boat.
We're going to talk about it though. We're going to step outside and we'll be right back after this.
One thing about being a fighter pilot, you always have to be prepared. On 9/11, we weren't. I was leading a training program when the first tower was hit. We were called into action to defend our home from whatever might be coming next. We cut the locks off a facility that hadn't been used in years, scrambling to arm our jets. Without weapons or being fully equipped, if something happened, we were ready to do whatever it took to defend freedom. Growing up, my dad instilled in me the importance of leadership, service, country. Serving in the Air Force allowed me to achieve my dreams of flying jets and serving my country. For years following those attacks, I patrolled our nation's skies to protect our homeland and to keep America safe. I later assumed command at Selfridge, Michigan's hometown air base, where I served our state and our nation. Now, our nation's values are under attack again. This time, we see it coming.
Welcome back for the fourth segment of the show. Once again, thank the Weber Wildlife Museum for graciously allowing us in here today to do the interview here. I still can't say enough about this place. I mean, it's just, we got bighorn sheep back here, we got elk here, we got mule deer, elephant, zebra. I mean, it goes on and on and on.
It does.
This is a jewel of Southeast Michigan, and if folks haven't had an opportunity here, certainly contact the Weber Group. They love to do tours and everything, but you just said you can walk around the world and see so much and learn quite a bit just in this one little area right in here.
Simply incredible. I've seen, exhibits before, and you see a little piece of this, a little piece of that. The store down the road has a real nice one down there, but even the one down in Dundee does. But this is just spectacular. This is simply incredible. So we want to thank them for allowing us to be here today to be able to do the interview.
And we've seen the movie Night at the Museum. I imagine what it's like at night around in this place when these all come to life. And all in here.
Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely.
It would be fun.
Well, they must all play together real nice because they're all still here. So.
Yeah.
Right.
But getting back to talking about the outdoors and what you could are wanting to do or be able to do to help preserve natural resources, hunting, fishing, trapping, all those great things that we love to do here in the state of Michigan and across the United States. One of the things that we're battling here, and is no secret, is the Asian carp, and they're coming up the rivers and making their way to Lake Michigan. Looking at that, I know the federal government has a lot of jurisdiction over waterways. What is your take on the Asian carp as far from a federal level, and what you could maybe facilitate to help take that cause a little further?
Well, okay, perfect. Invasive species as a whole, Asian carp is one example that we have of that, and certainly is a big player for us right now. The Phragmites and that type of stuff from the plant perspective. that when you have a species that come in that drives the others out and changes the ecosystem as a whole, it does have to be, once again, water goes between the states. We have to realize that there's equities that go beyond the state level, and so I do believe that there's a federal government role and responsibility in all of this. Asian carp, the example that you were using is, there's a number of technical solutions that can come out with that. You'd have physical barriers, you could have the electrical barriers, chemical, genetic. There's different ways to address it. And once again, I'm not the expert on how to do that, but we do need to make sure that we're addressing it at the right level. Are we doing this in the efficient manner, or do we have 50 different states trying to solve it 50 different ways in a federal government that's not providing that focus for us? This is where I think we have an opportunity for the federal government to be part of that solution again. Once again, not the solution, but we need to coordinate the efforts of the states so that we're being synergistic with everything that we're doing on these particular efforts. Once again, what's the right answer to it? That's for the experts to tell us. Then our job is to empower that and make that happen.
And like you said, it's not always putting money at the problem.
It's not. And a lot of it is, so, when I'm in Congress at the federal level, it's talking to the state level individuals also to make sure is that we have that relationship, we can talk about things. This isn't a partisan issue. This is taking care of our state. Things that we need to be good stewards of our environment going forward. And this should be bringing everybody together. So being able to address that, what are the right things? Our watersheds are common. And I'll take this just a little further. As you look into the 10th district itself, it's a very unique that you have northern Macomb County, which is very urban and industrial, but then very quickly you get up into some of the richest farmland that we have in the state of Michigan, right here in the thumb, and it's amazing some of the stuff that goes on. Well, what ties all this together is going to be this ecosystem. It's our watershed, it's our infrastructure, it's our communication abilities that we have that tie all this together. And that's where we need to make sure that we're focusing to solve these problems, because solving the problems for our wonderful farmers also solves the problem for our manufacturers and the PFAS, PFOA. All these things tie together. You can't just say it's one segment or one group that's being benefited here. It's one team, one fight, and we have to be able to get these things and address them.
Interesting you bring that up. That was something I've been thinking about is you got the farmers in this area, and all across the United States as well, but we've also got, the Great Lakes fisheries, we've got the inland waters here in this area, we've also got the wild game species that we love to hunt, and other species that we're not allowed to hunt that we love to see in this area. It's a very unique ecosystem right here within 20, 30, 40 miles you travel, and it changes very quickly.
Yeah.
With the farmers, how do we work with them on the ag side, especially with chemicals, because that's another hot topic right now of what chemicals actually get washed off of fields and into our watershed. I mean, we've seen Lake Erie with these big algae blooms. In the summer, that's happened in the last 2 or 3 years, I think. We've seen that in the news. And balancing that with what they need versus what these ecosystems need, and what the animals are taking in and ingesting that we eventually consume, and it winds up in our bodies. How do you make all that work together?
Well, once again, it's about relationships. The individual farmers, the level of science that goes into farming and all nowadays. I was just appalled at the news recently when one of our candidates for president kind of made fun of our farmers and talked about how simple it is and poking a stick in the ground and burying seed. Our farmers are amazing. Outside of being chemists, being very hardworking individuals and accountants and all these different things that
mechanics,
every farmer I
meteorologists,
know
everything
is
they got to do.
CEO
Yeah.
of a corporation and how they work. But just, how we care for soil, how we do fertilizer, and the level of the science that goes into that nowadays, it really is, if we're doing something that has a negative effect somewhere down the train, we need to be talking with these folks and going back up through the right chains to bring it together and just make sure that we're communicating. Because a lot of times we're doing things with great intent, everything's, but there's a second or third order effect down here. Well, let's adjust it up here. I think there's ways that we can. People want to do the right thing. There's nobody malicious out there that says, I want to pour poison in the ground and drop it off into the lakes.
Right.
It's just not that way. We love the land, the people love the land, the farmers like to do, they want to care for this land. People, the boaters, and everybody wants to make sure we're doing the right thing. And it's just bringing people together to share that common vision. And when there's an issue, let's just make sure we're talking it, not finger pointing, yelling, and everything else. It's where is it we need to, and what's the technical solution? Let's implement it. But there are great organizations, I'll go back to like the Farm Bureau here that looks at all the different types of commodities and what they do in dairying versus what they do with sugar beets versus, how do these all come together? What are the equities and how do we make sure that we're dealing, hunting, fishing? They all tie together.
Absolutely.
And there's wonderful people that want to make sure we're doing the right thing, and that's what we want to encourage.
Kind of to wrap the whole ball of wax up here, with the outdoors. Right now, the biggest thing that I think that we face as outdoorsmen is recruitment, and that's getting new people involved in the outdoors, whether it be children, whether it be women, whether it be people our age who's never had that opportunity to be able to go out fishing or hunting for whatever reason. On the national level, the Pittman-Robertson money and that we've got that comes off the excise tax off of our goods that we buy for hunting and fishing, that goes back in and helps to educate people and to have hunter recruitment and to work with our wildlife and our habitat. What would you do on behalf of the outdoorsmen? What do you think about furthering that cause and taking and doing something to guarantee, maybe not guarantee, but to help along getting people involved in the outdoors? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, part of it's just awareness, all right? So we need to understand, if you live in the urban area here in Macomb County, why does it matter what goes on up in the thub in the sugar beet industry? Or what is the sugar beet industry?
Mm-hmm.
And to understand, or the dairy farmers and the issues that they have and why does it matter to them? So a lot of times it's simply an education, bringing things to light, telling people the stories. When it comes to being engaged outdoors, a lot of I hearken back to the days when I was a young kid and a teen. I spent 80-90% of my life outside.
Yep,
that's what we did.
Absolutely.
I built forts. You name it. We did it out there in the woods. My grandfather in Colorado had a farm there, and that's where I'd spend my summers. Anywhere from building go-karts out there to go through the fields to working with him, hunting, fishing. Man, we spent so much time fishing trout in Colorado, and nowadays so many people spend so much time staring at screens. As you got your phone there as a good example. But we can use that tool to talk to people where they are, to tell the story of what's going on. And I think that's one of the things we can do at the federal level. Certainly as a representative, my job is to make sure that everybody understands why is this important to them. Let's show off what we do. That's what we did at Selfridge. Bring people out to Selfridge. Let's tell the story. Let's do the 100th anniversary. Let's talk about the F-35. Well, we can do the same thing as, hey, let's talk about these different industries that we have. The cash crops and everything in this agricultural land. I bet a lot of people in the 10th district don't understand that this is some of the coolest farmland that we have, the most productive farmland in the state. What are their issues? Why does it matter? Why does USMCA matter to our dairy farmers and the markets and the Chinese deal that we had recently that President Trump helped bring out that's going to improve trade, and why does that matter to Michigan? And why is it important that we advocate for it? And it's simply an education and awareness thing. So I think there's a huge role with that. Once again, should it be funded by the federal government? No, not necessarily. But we should empower it, we should facilitate it, and we should be a voice of it.
How do we get started with something like that? I mean, that sounds to me like really a grassroots effort versus, like you said, something on a big grand scale. I mean, you empower it, but where would you start with something like that?
It starts with individuals. Like I said, in Congress, my job would be when I'm talking in Macomb, make sure that I'm talking about things that are going on in Huron County or in St. Clair County. Let's make sure that we're talking these equities and people understand what this sinew is that connects us all together. And once again, it's an opportunity, outreach. We're so focused sometimes on taking care of our area that we forget to bring others in. We can do so much more through collaboration and by teamwork, partnerships, than we're ever going to be able to do by ourselves. And there's so many opportunities that we can bring together. And that's not a funding issue. It's simply introducing the people, let them understand what they have in common, turn them loose and empower them.
Getting like-minded people together.
Amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, kind of to wrap this segment up, looking at the hunting side of things, the fishing side of things, states here recently, I mean, we start with the Second Amendment, and we talk about that as being a constitutional right. That it's a guaranteed right, that we are given that right by the Creator himself to be able to protect ourselves. And owning firearms is one of those things. Along the hunting and fishing side, there's a few states now that have picked up the ball and started changing their state constitution with the right to hunt, fish, and trap.
Okay.
Is that something that you could see happening across on a federal level for the U.S. or the U.S. population to be able to hunt, fish, and trap and have that as a right?
I think as a whole, yes. How that's applied, though, the devil's always in the details, right?
On a state level.
Yeah, because for example, the one that, as you're talking that, comes to mind is, should we be able to go hunt bald eagles?
No.
Oh, absolutely not.
Right.
There are times and places that we have to understand that it's not the right thing to do. So yes, the ability to hunt and fish, but it needs to be done in a smart way, in a responsible way. And I think that's where individual states are going to have a lot clearer focus on what's important to the state. There's federal protected species and all that we have out there, and there's a reason for that.
Absolutely.
I've come across a bald eagle that's been shot, and I tell you what, that just burns me.
Yep.
When I see something like that. Irresponsible gun ownership or usage at any level, it goes against everything I stand for. Once again, empowering the states with the smart things, but there's a time and a place that we step in to do the right things for the right reasons at a federal level.
Yeah, I've heard people talk about that it's a privilege, not a right. But along those same lines, gun ownership, is a right. But I don't want to use the word privilege, but given the wrong instance, you do something wrong, those rights are taken away because you violated the law or
That's the basis of
it's
our
a
legal
moral
system.
code. Yes.
You don't drive responsibility, they take your driver's license away. So yeah, there's a time and a place that is the solution to indiscretions.
Okay, I tell you what, we want to take a little different avenue here with this next segment. So we're going to step outside. We're going to ask something a little more personal on the personal level here and have a little fun when we come back for our last segment of the show. So
I'm scared.
You ought to be. Wait for Danny here. He can be brutal at times. But we're going to step outside and we'll be right back after this.
One thing about being a fighter pilot, you always have to be prepared. On 9/11, we weren't. I was leading a training program when the first tower was hit. We were called into action to defend our home from whatever might be coming next. We cut the locks off a facility that hadn't been used in years, scrambling to arm our jets. Without weapons or being fully equipped, if something happened, we were ready to do whatever it took to defend freedom. Growing up, my dad instilled in me the importance of leadership, service, country. Serving in the Air Force allowed me to achieve my dreams of flying jets and serving my country. For years following those attacks, I patrolled our nation's skies to protect our homeland and to keep America safe. I later assumed command at Selfridge, Michigan's hometown air base, where I served our state and our nation. Now, our nation's values are under attack again. This time, we see it coming. Washington is being overrun by politicians driven by their own self-interests that do not represent the values that I fought to protect. Professional politicians so consumed by endless investigations and impeachment that they are failing the people they were elected to serve. We need real leaders in Washington who will stand up for the values that this country was built on. I'm General Doug Odie Slocum, and I'm running for Congress because our nation's under attack, and I'll do what it takes to defend it. I'll fight to secure the border and continue to protect our homeland. As a Christian and a father, I'll protect the things that truly matter and defend the right to life at all stages. And I'll work with President Trump to continue to grow our economy, to fight radical policies, and to lead on issues important to our country, to Michigan. We don't need more of the same in Washington. We need a total commitment to defend freedom, no matter what it takes. At Selfridge, we came together to make a difference. Now, it's time for a new mission. If you're ready, I'm ready. Fight's on.
You folks really need to be here in the commercial break portion here when we step away, because there's really some really good conversations that go on.
Especially when you got guys behind the cameras giving you criticism.
Feedback.
We'll call it feedback.
I'm gonna let Danny run with this first question because he's sitting closer to him and he's got the hook on his side and he's already been threatened to get hooked with it. So
Right. So we're sitting in this wonderful place. This gentleman here is going out on a limb to try to become elected, and I can only imagine what you're going through and what could be dug up on you, whatever goes through. But I've seen the movie Top Gun. I know Maverick. I know Goose. I know all those good ones. It's like, yeah, we got Odie.
Yes, you do.
And why do we have Odie? Because I got to know the story as to how you got it or how were you given it?
I was given it.
Given.
Yes.
Is that the tradition to be given a name?
You know, there's different ways in different communities in the Air Force. The A-10 community, they actually have a very formal process they go through and naming ceremonies where it's bestowed upon them at a certain point based on their behaviors or their performance or some clown act they did at some point. All of a sudden a label sticks to you at some point in there. Mine's a little bit of a different story on how I ended up with that is, I joined the Arizona Guard. I was one of the newest and youngest instructor pilots that we had at the time. And they assigned me the job of being in charge of the briefing rooms, which on the pecking order was probably right below being a janitor. It was cleaning up after people, doing a lot of the work that people didn't like. And it was a girl that was working in the command post one day that said I was kind of like Garfield's little dog Odie that always gets kicked and never complained. She goes, you're always doing that work and you just do it and you're always just happy about it. And she looked at me one time and she went, "Arf!" When she arfed, it stuck. So immediately my call sign at that point became Odie. You got Top Gun, you got Iceman and Maverick and Goose. And Odie, really intimidating, brings fear to the enemy.
I'm sure you read that on the side of your plane, and they just look at you and go, But no, that's what I needed to know because I was, Well,
and a lot of people wonder is why, what's Odie? And, we have to kind of describe that a lot of times. It's the fighter pilot call sign, and I think most people relate, old enough to remember, like you and I, the Top Gun,
right?
One of the greatest PR type movies for fighter pilots ever. That it's a call sign, it's a nickname, and so many people call me that, and most don't even know my real name. There's so many folks in my life, even family, that just refer to me as Odie. So it's kind of important that I include that because that's kind of the branding a little bit. But then I also have to explain it. So it's a good question.
It is your branding. It is your branding. But like Mike, we always do with our interviews and getting in onto the personal side of Odie here. We talked about the Second Amendment and stuff like that. But now on a personal level, you're running around all over here and stuff.
It's very controlled and diplomatic. I'm not actually just running around all over here.
You are.
Okay.
I get that. But, there's got to be like a snack that you got to have. If you're outdoors or if you're doing something, you got to have a snack. What snack would you like to have in that vehicle as you're zipping around or flying around if you can have one up there?
A snack?
Yeah, your favorite snack.
Your go-to snack.
Go-to snack.
You're stopping at the gas station, picking up some.
Well, mine's kind of unique to my house and everything else because it's actually low-carb chocolate ice cream. And I have some of that about every single night. It's because I have to watch my sugar intake. And it's become kind of one of my vices in life is this low-carb ice cream that you can buy out there. So it's kind of my treat of the day. There's some power bars and everything that I like to eat too, but I'm not sure I'd call that a treat. So I guess it would have to be the ice cream. And it is a vice. If I don't get that in the evenings, I'm a pretty cranky guy. A lot of times. So, the scoop of that low-carb chocolate ice cream just makes my evenings.
It makes you a nice, even-keeled guy.
Well, along those same lines, you're out driving from one event to the other.
Yeah.
What's on your radio? What do you listen to?
Well, a lot of times now it's the news.
Okay.
I really kind of want to plug into what's going on, figuring out. But quite honestly, a lot of times I have the satellite radio, and it's between the 70s and 80s station. I like listening to the old rock music and everything else. That's kind of a safe space in a lot of ways. I like to listen to that and reminisce on a lot of music that, it drives my daughter nuts. If she's ever in my car and I plug that, she's like, no, keep going up. Let's at least get to the 90s or the 2000s or something like that. I get an eye roll from my 13-year-old daughter, here we go again.
Well, you mentioned back in the last segment about going fishing out in Colorado. Looking back, catching a trout on the stream, what's your favorite way to prepare that trout?
You know, he always grilled them. My grandfather did. You know, I was
Okay.
such a young kid, I don't think I was allowed to cook at that point in time. But we would literally fillet them and put them on the grill in the camper and everything that we would have out there. So that's all I remember, is it being prepared that particular way.
Shore lunch, right there right by the stream out in the camper, or on the grill out there on the fire.
Yeah, and it was always that way. It's not, I don't remember him like putting it in the freezer and eating it at the house and stuff later on. It was always, we ate what we caught while we were out and about. And he had his scout vehicle, and I can remember just endless hours driving off to the most obscure places in the middle of Colorado. Absolutely beautiful. You know, some of the areas that we had out there to be able to, but it was always trout with him. Now I love salmon. That's one of my favorite fish to eat. But at the time, as a kid, it was trout, trout, trout. That's all it seemed like we had out there in Colorado.
Looking back at that time in your life, whether it was in the woods or whether it was on the stream, what's one memory from the outdoors that sticks in your mind, and why?
I caught a fish once with a pair of needle-nose pliers.
Really? Oh, we got to hear this story.
Oh boy.
It was in Colorado. It was actually near my grandfather's farm in Eckert, Colorado. And there was a stream that went by there one time, and I was just walking along, and I saw a fish tail out from behind a rock. You know, so I could see it right down there in the stream. I was like, well, I don't have anything or whatever, and all I got's this. And down into the stream, and I was able to pull him out. I think he actually ended up flopping back into the stream and everything, but officially, I caught him with a pair of pliers, at least briefly. He was able to liberate himself and everything else and escape back, but I always took a lot of pride in being able to grab the pea from the hand.
There you go.
He's got the touch.
He
He's
does.
got the touch.
Or was at least lucky once.
Well, before we go today,
Yeah.
if somebody wants to contribute to your campaign or wants to know more about you, where can they go to find more information or contribute?
That's a great question, and thank you so much for that, because it is an important part, is to build the team, get the volunteers on board, send the message out about what's different, why this matters to the people of Michigan. So certainly we have our social media sites that, you know, you can put in Doug, Odie, Slocum, Slocum for Congress, but the website itself is slocumforcongress.com, and there's an option to be able to donate there, to be able to be part of the campaign. You know, equity, as I say, it's putting on the jersey of the team. To be able to help us achieve the vision that we're looking for here. And it's about responsible leadership. We want somebody that's going to be a great ambassador for the state of Michigan, that's going to provide the leadership that we need going forward. And it's all about the men and women in the state of Michigan. That's where my heart and my passion is to make sure we're taking care of our people, and appreciate anybody wanting to be part of our team. Come on board.
All right.
Once again, slocumforcongress.com.
And the primary is?
The 4th of August. And you bring up a great point, because we have a presidential primary coming up here in the very near future.
Yes.
And it's confusing to people. There's a presidential primary, then there's going to be a congressional primary for August. That's where it's going to be important that we vote, because that's going to determine who our candidates are going in November here for the 10th district. So remember to vote on the 4th of August.
Yeah, I think the presidential primary is the 10th.
I believe it's the 10th.
10th
Yep.
of March. So, and then in August, then we've got our regular state primaries. And then in November,
The general election.
we do
we're
it all
off
at
and
that
running.
point. So, and hopefully we're going to get to see you there.
Excellent, excellent. And we ought to support our president with what we're doing also. He's doing some great work in helping our country out.
Absolutely. All right. I tell you what, that's going to wrap it up here for us for this special edition of Up North Journal. Once again, we couldn't have done this here today without the Weber Wildlife Museum. We want to thank them for being so generous and allowing us to come in today. And hopefully we're going to have a little more about them here in the near future. So stay tuned for that. That'll do it for Danny and myself and the retired General Slocum here. Y'all take care and stay tuned. You never know what you're going to see from us. See you next time.